In a development that has surprised political observers across the spectrum, President Donald Trump and New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani have discovered an unexpected area of agreement that transcends their stark ideological differences, overhauling New York City's complex and often frustrating zoning laws. The revelation, which emerged this week through reporting on their private November meeting, offers insight into how two politicians from opposite ends of the political spectrum can find common ground on technical policy issues that affect millions of residents. According to sources with direct knowledge of the November 2025 Oval Office meeting between the president and the mayor-elect, the conversation took a substantive turn when Mamdani steered the discussion toward New York City's land use approval process. What might have seemed like an unusual topic for such a high-profile political meeting instead became an animated discussion that revealed shared frustrations with a system both men believe has failed the city. The zoning discussion was not idle policy talk. For Trump, a Queens-born real estate developer who built his fortune navigating New York's Byzantine development regulations, the city's uniform land use review procedure has been a source of frustration dating back decades. For Mamdani, a democratic socialist focused on creating affordable housing, the same regulatory framework represents a barrier to building the thousands of units he believes New York desperately needs. When Mamdani described how the current system slows housing construction and creates unnecessary delays, Trump reportedly became animated. According to a person granted anonymity to discuss details of the private meeting, the president told Mamdani, "If you can get that done, that'd be amazing. I wanted this to happen for years." The statement captures the rare convergence of interests between two figures who have spent months publicly attacking each other. Throughout the 2025 mayoral campaign, Trump repeatedly called Mamdani a communist and warned that electing him would destroy New York City. Mamdani, in turn, labeled Trump a fascist and promised to resist federal overreach into city affairs. Yet on this specific issue, their interests align in ways that reveal how local governance challenges can sometimes transcend partisan divides. Both men want to see more housing built in New York City, though they envision different types of housing and different pathways to achieve that goal. The Uniform Land Use Review Procedure, known universally in New York as ULURP, is the city's public review process for all proposed land use changes. Any development project requiring significant zoning modifications must navigate approval from multiple entities: the local community board, the borough president, the city planning commission, and finally, the city council. The process, designed to ensure community input and prevent harmful development, can take years to complete and add substantial uncertainty and cost to any major construction project. For Trump, whose career was built on large-scale real estate development in Manhattan, Queens, and Brooklyn, the ULURP process represents government bureaucracy at its worst. During his decades as a developer, Trump frequently clashed with community boards, city planners, and local politicians over projects that he believed were being unnecessarily delayed or blocked by political considerations rather than legitimate planning concerns. The president's frustration with New York zoning extends beyond personal business interests. In recent public appearances, including a January radio interview on WABC, Trump discussed his meetings with Mamdani and indicated ongoing communication about city issues. "It's politics, it's a nasty world," Trump said, "but I got along very well with him. We had some good meetings, some good talks." For Mamdani, zoning reform serves a different purpose, but arrives at a similar conclusion about the current system's failures. The mayor has made housing affordability the centerpiece of his administration, describing New York's housing crisis as a moral emergency that demands urgent action. His campaign promised to build 200,000 new affordable apartments over 10 years, a goal that requires dramatically accelerating the pace of housing construction. Achieving that construction pace, Mamdani has acknowledged, requires fundamentally reforming how the city approves new development. In recent statements, the mayor has called for increasing density around mass transit hubs, eliminating parking requirements that reduce the number of housing units that can be built on each site, and upzoning wealthy neighborhoods that have historically resisted new development. These positions represent a significant evolution in Mamdani's thinking about housing policy. As a state assembly member representing a Queens district, he was known primarily for championing tenant protections and rent regulation. But during his mayoral campaign and transition, Mamdani increasingly embraced what housing advocates call a "yes in my backyard" or YIMBY approach that prioritizes building more housing supply. The mayor's housing transition team, announced in late November, reflected this broadened coalition. It included both tenant advocates like C. Weaver, leader of the New York State Tenant Bloc, and pro-development voices like Anne Marie Gray, president of Open New York, a group that advocates for zoning reform and increased housing construction. Real estate industry representatives, including Jed Walentis, president of the Real Estate Board of New York, also participated. This all-of-the-above approach to housing policy creates space for collaboration with Trump on specific technical reforms, even as the two men disagree fundamentally on issues like immigration, taxation, and the role of government in providing social services. The ongoing communication between Trump and Mamdani about zoning has reportedly continued via text message since their November meeting. While the specific content of these messages remains private, sources indicate that the conversations focus on practical aspects of land use reform rather than broader political issues where the two men have irreconcilable differences. The political implications of this collaboration are complex for both leaders. For Trump, showing willingness to work with a self-described Democratic Socialist mayor on practical governance issues could help counter criticism that his administration is purely ideological and unwilling to engage with Democratic officials. At a time when Trump faces political pressure over economic issues, particularly the cost of living, demonstrating cooperation on housing affordability provides useful messaging. For Mamdani, engaging productively with Trump on policy specifics serves multiple purposes. It helps secure federal cooperation on issues where New York City depends on Washington, including infrastructure funding and regulatory approvals. It also demonstrates to moderate voters that the mayor can work across ideological lines when doing so benefits the city, potentially inoculating him against attacks that he is too radical to govern effectively. The practical obstacles to zoning reform remain formidable regardless of Trump and Mamdani's private agreement. Many of the most significant barriers to housing construction in New York City are controlled by state government rather than city officials. Governor Kathy Hochul and the New York State Legislature would need to approve changes to parking requirements, density limits, and other regulations that currently constrain development. Community opposition to new development, particularly in wealthy neighborhoods, represents another significant barrier. While Mamdani has called for upzoning areas that have historically resisted new housing, implementing such changes requires navigating intense political resistance from homeowners and community groups who fear that increased density will change neighborhood character, strain infrastructure, and reduce property values. Environmental review requirements also slow development significantly. The State Environmental Quality Review Act, or SEQRA, requires detailed environmental impact studies for major projects. While these reviews serve important purposes, they add months or years to project timelines and create opportunities for opponents to delay or block development through litigation. Despite these obstacles, the fact that Trump and Mamdani have identified zoning reform as common ground suggests that movement on this issue may be possible. Real estate investors and developers are already responding to signals that streamlining could occur. Market analysts are examining which neighborhoods might see increased development if by-right construction becomes easier, meaning projects that can proceed without requiring special permits or zoning changes. Areas near subway stations are particularly likely to benefit from any zoning liberalization. Mamdani has explicitly called for increasing density around transit hubs, arguing that building housing near public transportation serves both affordability and environmental goals. This position aligns with broader urbanist thinking about sustainable development and could attract support from climate advocates concerned about reducing car dependence. The potential for zoning reform to affect housing costs remains a subject of debate among economists and housing policy experts. Increasing supply generally puts downward pressure on prices, but the effects vary by location and take years to materialize. Neighborhoods that see significant new construction might experience rent moderation, while areas that remain constrained continue to see price increases. For market rate development, streamlined zoning primarily benefits developers and future residents by reducing costs and uncertainty. For affordable housing, the effects depend on how reforms interact with subsidy programs and inclusionary zoning requirements that mandate below-market units in new buildings. Mamdani's housing agenda extends beyond zoning reform to include massive public investment in affordable housing construction. His plan calls for the city to finance 200,000 rent-stabilized apartments over a decade, requiring up to $100 billion in municipal bonds and higher taxes on corporations and wealthy individuals. These proposals require state approval and face significant political and financial obstacles. The combination of supply-side zoning reforms and demand-side subsidies represents Mamdani's attempt to address housing affordability from multiple angles. Working with Trump on the regulatory reforms while pursuing progressive taxation and public investment with state Democrats allows the mayor to build coalitions across the political spectrum. The November meeting between Trump and Mamdani covered topics beyond zoning. The two men discussed utility costs, particularly Con Edison electricity rates, which Trump noted should decline given lower fuel costs. They talked about general affordability concerns and the economic pressures facing New York residents. But the zoning conversation appears to have been the most substantive area where they identified concrete opportunities for cooperation. Since that meeting, the relationship between the president and the mayor has experienced both cooperation and tension. Trump's threat to cut federal funding to sanctuary cities, delivered in January with a February 1st deadline, created a potential crisis. Mamdani responded by strengthening immigrant protection policies and preparing for legal battles to defend the city's sanctuary status. Yet the funding cuts did not materialize on Trump's stated timeline. As of early February, Mamdani reported that his office had received no notice of withheld federal dollars. This suggests that the private channel between the two leaders may be helping to prevent the most dramatic confrontations, even as public disagreements continue. On February 6th, Mamdani signed an executive order that appeared to directly challenge Trump's immigration enforcement priorities. The order prohibits federal agents from using city parking facilities as staging areas without judicial warrants and restricts data sharing with immigration authorities. These moves position New York as a center of resistance to federal immigration policy while technically maintaining the cooperative relationship on housing issues. The ability to compartmentalize cooperation and conflict represents sophisticated political management by both leaders. They can work together on specific policy areas where interests align while maintaining their positions on issues where they fundamentally disagree. This approach allows both to serve their political bases without sacrificing practical governance. For the real estate and construction industries, the Trump-Mamdani alignment on zoning creates optimism about potential reforms. Developers and builders have long complained that New York's approval process adds unnecessary costs and delays that ultimately reduce housing supply and increase prices. Even modest streamlining could accelerate projects and improve development economics. Home builders, general contractors, and construction material suppliers all stand to benefit from increased building activity if reforms materialize. Property owners near transit stations could see land values increase if upzoning allows more intensive development. Conversely, areas that remain downzoned or face stricter regulations might see relative value declines. Labor unions, which have significant political influence in New York, generally support increased construction activity that creates union jobs. Mamdani has promised that city-financed affordable housing would be built with union labor, creating an alliance between progressive housing advocates and organized labor that could provide political support for reforms. The immediate future of zoning reform depends on several factors outside Trump and Mamdani's direct control. Governor Hochul's position will be crucial, as many necessary changes require state legislation or approval. The City Council, where Mamdani lacks a strong majority, must also support significant reforms. Community boards and neighborhood groups will fight changes they perceive as threatening. Yet the fact that a sitting president and a newly elected mayor from opposite political parties have identified this issue as common ground creates momentum. If Trump uses federal leverage to encourage state cooperation, and if Mamdani builds local coalitions supporting reform, meaningful change becomes possible. The political oddity of Trump and Mamdani collaborating on housing policy reflects broader shifts in American politics. Traditional partisan alignments have weakened as voters increasingly prioritize specific issues over party loyalty. Housing costs affect Americans across the political spectrum, creating opportunities for unexpected coalitions focused on practical solutions rather than ideological purity. For observers of New York politics, the zoning discussion between Trump and Mamdani represents the most concrete example yet of how their surprising relationship might produce tangible results. While their cooperation on immigration policy or taxation remains impossible given fundamental disagreements, technical reforms to land use regulation offer space for progress. Whether this alignment produces actual policy changes remains uncertain. Converting private agreement into legislative action requires navigating complex political dynamics and overcoming entrenched opposition. But the revelation that these conversations are occurring and continuing via text message suggests that both leaders see value in maintaining this channel of communication. As Mamdani enters his second month as mayor, his ability to deliver on housing promises will significantly affect his political future. If cooperation with Trump helps accelerate zoning reform and housing construction, it could vindicate his pragmatic approach to working across party lines. If reforms stall despite private agreements, critics will question whether the relationship serves any substantive purpose beyond political theater. For Trump, engaging seriously with a Democratic Socialist mayor on policy substance rather than purely political posturing represents a departure from typical partisan warfare. Whether this reflects genuine interest in solving problems or tactical maneuvering to appear reasonable on economic issues that concern voters remains subject to interpretation. What seems clear is that New York City's zoning laws, an arcane topic that rarely generates national attention, have become an unlikely point of connection between two of America's most polarizing political figures. If that connection produces meaningful reform that increases housing construction and improves affordability, it would represent a rare example of practical governance transcending partisan division in contemporary American politics.